Hello friends, I welcome you back to this online session on English poetry. In the last few sessions, we were discussing about Elizabethan poetry, first module prescribed to you. This is a general topic that we are supposed to understand, and in this general topic, we are supposed to understand what the period of the historical, social, and cultural background of Elizabethan poetry. In the last few sessions, we have also discussed certain characteristic features of Elizabethan poetry. As I told you, that when we were thinking about a historical categorization of literature, when we were calling as a Elizabethan poetry, it does not mean the only to its political connotation, but it also, besides the political connotation, besides the parallel notion of a political history of the nation, it is also there are certain characteristic features that constitute this nomenclature, this title, that is an Elizabethan poetry. So in the last few sessions we were discussing the characteristic features that constitute the definition, that constitute the nomenclature, that constitute the title Elizabethan poetry. Why we call certain poets and certain poetry produced by them as a Elizabethan poetry. What is the reason that we were categorizing them for under a specific title? So we discussed it all in detail in the last sessions, in the last week. When we were discussing about Elizabethan poetry, we discussed about the social, cultural, political, religious background of Elizabethan period and how this Elizabethan period influences Elizabethan literature. We also came to know that this is the period which is known as golden period of literature. So let us continue the discussion of Elizabethan poetry characteristics. And while discussing the characteristics, it also becomes very important to understand the poets who contribute into this historical category of Elizabethan poetry. So see, in the last session we have discussed this characteristics of Elizabethan poetry, witnessed the upsurge of literary production. We came to know that uh, it is a great progression in terms of form and technique, form and theme. It is a lyrical poetry, 14-line poem that we also learn about the sonnet form that becomes a very popular in this particular period. Then we learn about the Italian sonnet that is also called as a Petrarchan sonnet, and we also learn that there is one more, that is a English sonnet, that is also called as a Shakespearean sonnet. So this is what we learn in the last session. We see the Watt and Surrey's contribution in bringing sonnet form from Italy to England. Then we characteristics of Elizabethan poetry. While discussing this, we also discussed the Petrarchan, Spenserian, and then uh, again Shakespearean sonnet. Last session we have completed this part of this PPT. So now let us continue with uh, the next slides. See the characteristics of Elizabethan poetry. So Henry Howard invented a new poetic form known as a blank verse. See, this is also a very important progression in the form of a poetry. Uh, Before the invention of black verse, you can see the poetry is always written in a specific rhyme and rhythm, and this rhyme and rhythms were set by the classical masters of poetry, that is the Greek masters of poetry. So we have to follow that. So that is also called as a classical poetry, where the meters, rhymes, rhythms were strictly followed. But in this Elizabethan period, when Henry Howard start using a blank verse, it becomes very popular. So we should answer the question that why this blank verse was invented in this period, why the people start writing in this period in a blank verse. So understand that Elizabethan period is also marked as a period of a mass education. There are so many people who start writing in English, who start reading first and then start writing in English. And as a result of that, and they were not following the classical masters from a Greek and Roman literature, but they were following their own emotions. And as their emotions go, they write their poetry, they design their poetry. So instead of following or strictly following, adhering to the classical rules of a poetry, they try start to reject that, and they try to grab, they try to design their poetry in a blank verse. So blank verse, though it is blank verse means there is no rhyme, there is no rhythm in the poetry. You can see when we think about a Marathi poetry, when we think about Mangesh Padgaokar's poetry, for example, he write in a romantic age of Marathi poetry. But you can see he also write in a blank verse. For example, his poem Hazar Haat Aste Tar. It is like a communication. हजार हात असते तर हजार हातांनी लिहिले असता केला असता सलाम सलाम मेरे भाइयों और बहनों सभी को सलाम गल्लीतल्या दादाला सलाम दादाच्या कुत्र्यांना सलाम सलाम मेरे भाइयों और बहनों सभी को सलाम. So you can see there is no rhyme as such in this kind of a poetry that we found, that we can trace in the classical poetry of the earlier period. So this is also a departure from the strict adherence to the classical rules of the poetry. So they start writing in a blank verse. So blank verse is also one of the most important characteristic features of Elizabethan poetry. We can say that this is the most important contribution of this period to the literature, because as this blank verse was become popular in this particular period, it also influences the upcoming ages of literary history. So this is what the blank verse, which is one of the most important characteristics of Elizabethan poetry. So this blank verse is defined as a poetic lines having metrical patterns but lacking rhyme, as I told you. Blank verse indicate unrhymed poetic lines written in iambic pentameter. We will see what exactly the iambic pentameter is. It is not a very difficult one. It is also a very simple one, and that's why it becomes very popular. Blank verse and iambic pentameter. Why it becomes so popular? Because both these things are very simple one. They were not something very complex one, because they were not writing or they were not dealing with the complex ideas. They were dealing with the simple emotions, emotions of a common man, emotions of a common public. So they don't require a complex kind of metrical patterns or adherent to the classical rules. Instead of that, what they do, they start writing in a blank verse and iambic pentameter. Both these things are very simple one to follow. They easily understand it, and they find it a very good vehicle of their emotions. And as a result of that, they start using blank verse and a iambic pentameter. Then some critics claim that Henry Howard was just inspired by some Latin poetry because the classical Latin verse had not used rhyme. So you can see when we were thinking about history, there are several things, there are several uh, other patterns or other thoughts that were there, or we can see that historical truth, when we think about historical truth, there are the theories of truth. So one of few of the critics also claim that Henry Howard he follows this Latin poetry, and this Latin poetry, classical Latin verse, had no use of rhyme. So he start using no rhymes in his poetry, So in that way the blank verse came into exist. So this is again one theory that is written or that is advocated by few of the critics. So but this theory is more valid than the other theories, that how this blank verse came into exist into the Elizabethan period. Then other kinds of forms of poetry dominated during the Elizabethan age may include. So what are the other forms of a poetry that also influences a lot in this Elizabethan poetry? See, metaphysical poetry. This is also a school of a poetry that we are supposed to learn even as a general topic, and we are also supposed to learn the poems contributed in this school, metaphysical school of poetry. So metaphysical poetry, then prosody, blank verse, dramatic poetry is also very important in this particular period. This is the period Shakespeare also introduces a poetry in drama. So I told you that in Macbeth, you can see there is a poetry. These three witches were singing bubble. They were cooking something, and there is a bubble in that pot. And when they saw that bubble in the pot, they start singing, "Bubble, bubble, triple the trouble." Bubble, bubble, triple the trouble means they were telling Macbeth that your trouble will be tripled, and they use a song. The song is also very famous. If you want to read it, it is available online. So so this dramatic poetry also becomes very important in this particular period. Then pastoral poetry, as I told you, this period is marked as a mass education, and as this poetry is marked as a mass education, most of the poets from rural area start writing the poetry. What happens when we think about the literature before Elizabethan period? uh, you can see what I am telling you again and again, that Elizabethan poetry is a point of departure. We or literature moves from its orthodox origin to the modern developed stages. So this is what you can see is a period of a transition. We were moving from one point to the another point. So in this poetry, as most of the people, uh, as this period is marked as a uh, mass education, many poets, many people start reading and writing, and the focus before Elizabethan period, you can see that we only the population who were living in the urban centers, they can afford to read, they can only afford to write. So literature is limited to the particular group of a society that is called as an aristocratic society. So this aristocratic people write aristocratic literature for aristocratic society. So Elizabethan period, you can see the as this Caxton publishes different titles, different books from Latin and Latin and Greek literature, in translated into English and published it and distributed among the public. It also reached to the rural parts of the England, and there also these poets or the people start reading and start producing literature. So pastoral element also becomes very important in Elizabethan poetry, and it also emerges as one of the most important characteristic features of a Elizabethan poetry. So pastoral poetry is also very important in this particular period. Then see, metaphysical poetry is highly intellectualized, uses a strange imagery and frequent paradoxes, and contain extremely complicated conceits, prolonged, varied analogy between dissimilar ideas or objects. So I am not going into detail of this definition of metaphysical poetry, because we are supposed to read or we are supposed to deal with a metaphysical poetry as a general topic. So we will go into detail of metaphysical poetry, characteristic features, and again the contributors of metaphysical poetry when we will deal with the module that is prescribed to you, metaphysical poetry. So in general, or in a simple word, you can say that this poetry is a very varied kind of poetry. What they were doing, as I told you, that this is a period marked as a period of education. So the poets uh, who were writing poetry in this particular period, they were well read. They were reading in a reading the text of a medicine. They were reading the text of an architecture. They were reading the text of a astrology. And what they are doing, they are mixing, they are uh, bringing all these reading into their poetry. So and instead of following the classical model, they follow the classical model, but in a very varied kind of style they were using this model. So metaphysical poetry is also very significant contribution of this period to the literature. Then see characteristics: wit and elaborate style, paradoxes and puns, imagery from the emergent sciences, questions on the nature of reality in philosophical way, skeptical nature, and fluctuating reflections. So this is what are the characteristics of a metaphysical poetry, and this is also the characteristics of a in general about a Elizabethan poetry. You can see wit and elaborate style is there, paradoxes and puns. When we will read the contributors of Elizabethan poetry, we will also read certain poems that were not prescribed to you, but they are very popular in this particular period. So only to understand the characteristic features of Elizabethan poetry, we will read that. Then characteristics: wit, wit and elaborate style, paradoxes and puns, imagery from the emergent sciences. So they were not going into the biblical mythology. They were moving toward the scientific reasons. They were dealing with the science, real science. Then, so they gave a exposure. They deal with, they explore the scientific questions into their poetry, and they pose a nature of reality, the questions on nature of reality in philosophical way. So this is what you can see is also the beginning when we think about when we think in a modern and postmodern period about a deconstruction. We should find its root in Elizabethan period, because this is the period when everybody start thinking differently. They start rejecting the notions that were established in a philosophy, that were established in a science, that were established in culture, religion, and they starting to understand it with a logic instead of understanding it with a belief. So this belief afterwards become a disbelief. So it produces, this period produces a period of a disbelief, that afterwards if we think it and its historical development or historical stages, you can see modernism and postmodernism is a varied or extreme point of this disbelief. So this is what you can see is a characteristics. See then characteristics of Elizabethan poetry, and there you can see the major Elizabethan themes and Elizabethan poets. You can see both these are very important one. So major Elizabethan themes, see courtly love, mutability of life, religion and pity, rebirth and regeneration, rear of death. So this is a fear of death especially. Inflection and spiritual purification, immortality, platonic love, nationalism, reformation. So these are the major Elizabethan themes. The poets write about these themes. So see what are the contributors of this particular period. So in Elizabethan poets, you can see Thomas Watt, Henry Hayward, Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney, Christopher Marlowe, Sir Walter Regin, William Shakespeare, John Donne, and John Milton. And we have also put here the very famous poems of these poets. If it is possible for you, it is available on a poetryhunter.com. It is all these poets were available online. So if it is possible, so you have a ample time to read now, so you can read these poems, and I also suggest you that you should read these poems. They are very interesting kind of poems. Thomas Watt's Whose List to Hunt, we will see this poem when we were thinking about Thomas Watt, we will read it. Then Henry Hayward's Description of a Spring, Edmund Spenser, To His Love, Sir Philip Sidney, A Litany, Christopher Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. We will see this poem also. Sir Walter Raleigh's Answer to Marlowe. Then William Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 and Sonnet 65. I am suggesting you to read all these original poems on a poetryhunter.com. Then John Donne, Better My Heart, and then John Milton on his blindness. So these are the poets. So in this session we have completed, or we have once again have a review of characteristics of Elizabethan poetry, and we have also understood certain characteristic features like blank verse, new characteristic features that we haven't discussed earlier. Blank verse, iambic pentameter, metaphysical poetry, these things we learn in this session. So in the next session we will continue with Elizabethan poets, especially we will begin with a Thomas Watt and Henry Hayward's contribution to the Elizabethan poetry. So we will stop here and continue the same in the next session. Please attend the lectures. It is necessary for you, and what I am suggesting you to read it. You have an ample time to read now. Afterwards, as time goes and the new the semester appears, you should concentrate on the prescribed texts and prescribed topics. So this is my suggestion to you, that you should start reading, and ample material is available online. So start reading this. We will stop here, continue the same in the next session. Thank you for listening.